so. I'm excited to be your first Canadian guest, eh?
Mark Graben and Jamie Flinchball are two guys drinking whiskey while chatting about lean ideas, experiences, and news. Let's hope they hold their liquor because they're not holding back on sharing their opinions. It's time for Lean Whiskey, Lean Talk with a fun spirit.
Well, hi, everybody. This is Mark Graben. Welcome to episode 12 of the Lean Whiskey podcast. I'm back after Jamie Flinchbaugh did the last episode with his old friend Susan Pleasant. Jamie and I are going to do the next episode together, but today I'm joined by an old friend of mine, Ryan McCormick. Ryan, how are you? Welcome to the podcast.
I'm doing well. Thanks for having me, and it's good that you finally ventured up north with your podcast.
Yeah. I'm glad I'm not physically ventured up there right here in January. How cold is it up there? Well, first off, tell everyone to whatever level of detail you want, exactly where you are.
Yeah, sure.
How's the weather?
Yeah, no, I'm based out of sunny Winnipeg, Manitoba, Canada. Currently, this is not a hot tourist spot these days. We're probably around minus 20 degrees Celsius, which actually isn't unusual for this time of year. But I don't know if anyone's been following the news too. Our friends out in Newfoundland had, I think, 70 centimeters, which is a little over a yard for the American.
I already went and Googled that minus 20 Celsius is minus 4 Fahrenheit. You're killing me with the metrics, but go ahead.
No, I'm kidding. It's not a yard anyways. I'm just making that up. But
not a meter? Wait, no.
Yard, yeah.
No, you fooled me.
But it's been a typical Canadian winter here in Winnipeg. So that's why lean whiskey is just what the doctor ordered and sort of stay warm up here.
Yeah. And people who read, we're going to talk about how we got to know each other. And for people who read Lean Blog might realize that I reached out to Ryan maybe a year ago and said, hey, you were putting out these really cool emails called the Operational Excellence Mixtape. And do you have these archived online? And you said, well, no, not really, right?
No, I don't manage them. It's something I started doing many years ago when I worked in a hospital here in Winnipeg, just to, partly keep my own skills up, but also people were asking me what are some articles that are related to lean, especially lean in healthcare. So I started compiling this for work every couple of weeks, and then other people started forwarding it to people. And so I just started doing it every 2 weeks, probably for the last 7 or 8 years now.
Wow. So I think I went back and with your permission, a year and a half's worth of putting those on the blog to have them archived and let people find them. And so people go to leanblog.org and scroll down the main page. There's a section dedicated to the mixtapes, and you can, of course, encourage you to subscribe to Ryan's emails. But there's always a lot of really good things to read and to listen to. And when we talk about our articles from the news, that's the type of stuff that's in the mixtape. So if we were to talk about every article in your bi-weekly mixtape, it would be like a 10-hour long podcast, I think. Yeah,
there's usually a good, I probably edit down to the dozen that I thought would be the most interesting to anybody out there. So otherwise it would be a lot. But actually, it is interesting to see 7-8 years ago there's a lot less material on lean and lean principles in the news. But today it's actually not hard to encounter.
Yeah. So I encourage everyone to look at that. And thank you, Ryan, for doing those, and thank you for letting me share that. I probably, it earns me probably 17 cents a month in Google ad revenue for that contribution. So I owe you one.
That's right.
But no, the real reason for doing the blog and sharing this is just to be helpful. And
that is American money. So
that's worth how much Canadian these days? I lost track of.
Oh, it's worth more usually. So that's all I know.
Yeah. So, one of the criteria, we're going to talk a little bit about how we've met. And, as I've talked about in other episodes and Jamie talked about last episode. One of the criteria is basically is that, like, is the guest somebody you've literally sat and had a drink with together in person? We're doing this virtually, of course, but you're somebody you've talked shop with and shot the breeze and had a few laughs, and we've all done. Ryan and I have done that, and it was through the Healthcare Value Network, which was something I was involved in 10 years ago. Did we meet, Ryan? Like I came to the hospital you were working for in Winnipeg at the time. Is that right?
Yes, I think you came at least once to my recollection.
Yeah. Oh, it was more. It was definitely more than once. Yeah.
But yeah, I think the first time I met you in person was there. I think the first time we had much communication, you might remember you had a contest for lean memes.
Yeah.
To win some books, and I for some reason got super into it, and then of course I actually won the contest, and you sent me some I think a copy of Healthcare Kaizen or Lean Hospitals.
And at least you didn't make a meme about getting a crappy prize for.
Absolutely not. Those are fantastic books. I still refer to them this day.
But yeah, and your memes are fantastic. So yeah, kind of a little side project that I have, leanmemes.com. It wasn't just for that contest. You've contributed a lot of.
I got a little carried away there for a good year and a half. So I got to admit, I put my meme career on hold for the last while. But it would be interesting. I haven't gone to that website in some time. It would be it would be a trip down memory lane to visit leanmemes.com and review some of my previous work.
But so you've exposed yourself, because on the website they just say by Ryan.
Oh yeah, of course.
I think you didn't want formal attribution, but the most recent one is a picture of Marie Kondo, and you put the text on there. Does your boss spark joy? With a question mark. And I'm not going to put you on the spot to answer that, but yeah, that was a good meme from about a year ago. Have you watched? Oh, go ahead.
Oh no, I'm sure you're asking about Marie Kondo. I actually have not watched the series. I do know it's extremely popular.
Yeah, I finally got Netflix a couple months ago, so I do have her in the list of things to watch. But I think I got Netflix. Were you one of the people who recommended the documentary American Factory?
Yeah, and that's why I was actually surprised when I sent it to you. I was like, "You gotta check this out." And you're like, "I don't have Netflix." I was a little surprised. You don't hear that too often these days. So,
I know.
What'd you think of it?
Oh, American Factory.
Yeah,
it was for one, like, that factory was literally where in the town I was born in, Dayton, Ohio. So that was an interesting connection. There were times that were funny, and then there were certainly cringeworthy moments, and I think the film set maybe the Chinese owners were going to be the bad guy, and there was certainly enough conflict between Chinese business culture and what American workers wanted. But the one American who spoke Chinese, and I'm sure you remember this moment, Ryan. He's in China and he's just sitting there complaining about the American workers. I'm like, oh yeah, things would be much better if we could put masking tape, or if we put duct tape over their mouths because they talk too much.
Yeah, I gotta admit, that was a moment where you kind of go, really? And you do have that, like you said, a cringeworthy moment when he said that. I remember that very clearly and having that reaction.
And he knew cameras were rolling, right? I mean, that's
absolutely. I'm sure he thought he was coming off great.
Yeah. Maybe I'll have him on the podcast sometime. I mean, I didn't totally Lincoln stalk the guy, but he's out there on LinkedIn. You can find his name. He works for the company still.
Oh, interesting.
Hey, come talk about this? I don't know if I want to do that. But so leanmemes.com is ask people to go check that out. And then one other thing Ryan and I did, you talk about actually physically venturing to Winnipeg. At Ryan's invitation, I came up and we did a workshop together around the book Measures of Success. So thank you for doing that. It was fun hanging out together up there.
That was great. It was an excellent workshop too. That was back in May this year. We had a mix of folks from industry and from healthcare. It's always great to see the red beads. Always never fails to deliver the message about systemic performance versus individual performance. And I do apply your methodology for process behavior charts fairly regularly now, because I was taught using Six Sigma tools many years ago, and you get bogged down by the P charts, the C charts, the U charts. What's the right chart? And the simplicity of the process behavior chart makes it so much easier to take these tools out to managers than trying to explain the different control charts and technical nature of those. So I really like the work. It has already paid off for me in my current role in helping proliferate these tools in a way that's easy to understand.
Yeah, well, thank you for that. I'm glad to hear that. And as Canadians and Americans, not just separated by the metric system or not, separated by a common language, right? As we say, a process behavior chart versus a process behavior chart. I think we can still follow each other, right?
Yes, I always forget that process sounds strange to most people on the continent.
So you mentioned healthcare, and we kind of alluded to it. I should have given you a better chance to introduce yourself, like a little bit about your career arc and some of the different things you've done for the listeners' benefit.
Sure. So I've been working in the lean and improvement field probably for about 19 years now. I started out in the sort of traditional way. I was working at a steel mill here in Manitoba when I was finishing up my engineering degree, and then I got a job offer at Boeing. Not too many people know there's actually a medium-sized manufacturing facility for Boeing here in Winnipeg that makes composite parts for commercial aircraft. And I just really got lucky because I got hired on right into at the time they had a lean promotion office or a Kaizen promotion office. And they were really invested in learning and applying lean principles to improve their manufacturing productions. And we were using a company that's fairly well known now, Shingi Jitsu, as the third-party consultant. So we had we had Japanese senseis teaching us, and it was a great opportunity to learn. And I'm in a small world scenario. My current manager is my manager from 19 years ago at Boeing. We reconnected a long time later, and our paths have crossed again. Unfortunately, that was in 2001, and then the events around 9/11, they scaled back production considerably, and I was laid off. But after that, I got into a organization, a food manufacturing company here in Canada that was promoting and applying Six Sigma in a classic Six Sigma way. So I was a black belt in Six Sigma working for a major food company. And you know what? Even though now in retrospect, I've come to loathe the expert-led improvement model or belt model, the training and exposure and the coaches I had there were of such tremendous quality that I just learned so much from them. Yeah. And while I was there, I was also taking my MBA part-time. And we had one of those sessional instructors come in and talk, and he was from healthcare, and he was talking about IT and healthcare, and they were getting ready to do more digital healthcare transformation. And I guess they read our bios, and he was looking for a lean and Six Sigma guy. So I talked to him after class, and one thing led to another. I ended up working in healthcare for about 10 years, and but we'll probably talk a bit more. We'll probably talk almost exclusively about that for the rest of this session. And then I currently work for a large Canadian mutual insurance company based out of Winnipeg. And still teaching and applying lean principles to create value for customers.
Yeah. Yeah, and so later you mentioned Shigejitsu. I think we'll have time. I think there's a funny story, or we'll be the judge of that, Ryan.
Yeah.
Funny story.
Yeah, I don't know. It might be funny for lean people, maybe.
Well, that's who's listening.
Yeah,
so I mean,
exactly.
you got to know your audience, and then I mean, maybe some of your family's listening, or they stopped listening.
I doubt that
3 minutes ago, but
yeah.
And then you mentioned about the Six Sigma belt approach, and that goes beyond. That sounds deeper than a pet peeve, but I think later we're each going to kind of go through a segment on pet peeves. But we got a couple news stories to get to, and there's a lot of stuff to talk about with the fun spirit. Even though I'm bumbling over my words, I have not had any of said spirit yet. So I think we're gonna shift into talking about what are you drinking. But again, I mentioned earlier, we've talked, we've alternated within the same conversation over a drink or two or three about like really serious topics, like we're going to eliminate patient harm in the world, and then we're laughing and having a good time. And I remember Palm Springs Lean Healthcare Transformation Summit. That was kind of a late night. Became a late night discussion. That was a good time.
That was a great. I really enjoyed. Anytime I had a chance to go to the Healthcare Lean Summit was fantastic. I specifically remember the Palm Springs as well, because there was I have a vague and fading memory of mini golfing that night too. After drinking.
Oh, I don't remember that. See, I'm never the last one standing. I know at some point I went to bed. We had a group, and we were being louder than we should have been, I think, because it was one of these hotels where like the bar was in like the central atrium, and I'm sure the sound was carrying more than it should have. But
yeah, we'd probably lack some discretion for sure.
But, and here today, the theme is like just the right amount of discretion. But Ryan, as our guest, and as you said, our first Canadian guest, let you choose the theme of the whiskeys. Why don't you tell us about the theme and what you're drinking, and tell us a little bit about that.
Sure. So tonight I'm drinking Crown Royal, which is fairly ubiquitous brand in Canada. Canada, we don't call it whiskey, we call it rye. I thought I'd go local, partly because Crown Royal is actually manufactured right here in Manitoba in a town called Gimli, which is about an hour north of Winnipeg. It's home to the largest Icelandic population outside of Iceland as well. So I'm actually drinking a specific blend called Northern Harvest Rye, which in 2015 somehow was named best whiskey in the world by a guy named Jim Murray, who procures something called the Whiskey Bible. And when he did that, it kind of came out of left field, and everything went a little nuts. There were lineups in the liquor stores here in Winnipeg to get this. I mean, and I'm not going to lie and tell you it's the best rye I've ever had. It's interesting. It's got that classic burn and spiciness that you come to expect from Canadian rye. But Crown Royal, I know Americans are familiar with this drink as well. In Canada, I think it still comes in the purple drawstring bag, where I recall vividly as a kid, there was always a couple of kids that showed up to school with the Crown bag as their pencil case, not commenting on their parents' situation or anything, but you would carry your marbles or your hockey cards, if you want to get really Canadian, in your Crown Royal purple drawstring bag. So it's a big brand here in Canada. It's it's 80 proof. It's 90% rye whiskey. Still, for me, it's a taste of nostalgia. It's a drink that's everywhere, anywhere you go in Canada, you can get Crown Royal.
Yeah. So, hey, and as I'm talking here, maybe I don't need to pull the andon cord. I was hearing a little bit of an echo, but now I'm not. So we'll just unpull. We'll pull the andon cord again. I think we can continue production here.
Okay.
But yeah, so I was going to say a couple things. So it's funny. Yeah, Jim Murray is considered very much a world expert. It's not just some blogger with a review. One of the whiskeys that I talked about in a previous episode from Texas, which, for me, that's drinking local. Garrison Brothers Balmoral whiskey was not named world's best whiskey, but it was named like best small craft producer, which is still quite an honor from Jim Murray. But yeah, the last thing you want is like your favorite whiskey to get that designation, because then it becomes really impossible to find. Kind of like what you were talking about with the lines, people searching for it.
Yeah, I think it was unexpected for a rather pedestrian rye like Crown Royal to be named the best whiskey in the world. But
so I'm drinking the most pedestrian of the pedestrian, because I went out and I've got a couple things I'm going to sample here. I've got like little 1 ounce pours. Because, everyone knows Crown Royal. I was doing a little research. By that, I mean looking at their website. And it said, it was not exported until 1964. It was created in 1939 to celebrate King George VI and Queen Elizabeth visiting Canada. And I'll tell you, I don't normally drink Canadian whiskey. Like I remember back in the day, like younger days, there's, that one friend who would always bring the purple bag of Crown Royal to the party, and he would mix a lot of Coca-Cola with it. And so I went out and this is not the main one I'm going to be tasting, but I bought basically a little airplane bottle, and it comes in its own little mini purple bag.
Awesome.
So of what I'm trying, I mean, this is the one that's in a plastic bottle with a screw cap for being an airplane bottle. Here, cheers. I'll make the sound effect because I have a couple glasses.
Cheers.
The Northern Harvest blend, and there's another one called the Bourbon Mash blend that are a little bit more expensive and probably a little better. Americans would, I'm surprised there hasn't been legal action about using the word bourbon, even in any indirect way.
Yeah, that is surprising. I'm not familiar with the with that blend.
But yeah, bourbon, bourbon is very much an American word. And like you said, it's funny, Canadians call it rye, even if it's not like in the US, an American rye whiskey by law has to be 51% rye. I don't think that's really true with Canadian. It's just more of a slang alternative word, right?
Yeah, I'm not sure. But even the most ryes you'll drink in Canada are 90%, or in the case of Alberta Premium, usually 100% rye.
So with all things, there's that variety, and but so it's funny you mentioned Alberta Premium Distillery. So the second one I'm drinking, which is also an airplane bottle. It's funny. It's a glass bottle with a little cork stopper. It's called Whistle Pig Straight Rye Whiskey, and it's purported to be from Vermont. But the deal is that the whiskey is actually sourced from Alberta Premium. Did you know this?
I have never heard of this rye, but I mean, Alberta Premium's a major distiller in Canada, and they're known primarily for being the 100% rye.
And this one's 100% rye. I mean, I've had different Whistle Pig bottlings before. I thought the little mini bottle was kind of cute. So yeah, there's a big difference between the Crown Royal and the Whistle Pig. Canadians are known for being polite, so I'm doing my best to be polite. I'll give credit. The Whistle Pig, I'll give it credit for being Canadian rye, and I do like it better than the Crown Royal. But you'll have to look for that. I wonder if it then gets re-exported back to Canada.
Yeah, then we're clamoring for some Vermont rye in Canada, only to find out it's from Alberta.
It would be funny if somebody was like, "Oh, I don't like Canadian rye, but this Whistle Pig, though, that's the good, that good old Vermont rye." They don't know.
The rye snobs will be clamoring for the rural Vermont rye and ignorant of its origins here in Alberta.
Yeah, but I think there's a difference. Like you used the word manufactured with Crown Royal, and that's probably the right word to use at such large volumes. At such the scale. The Crown Royal, it said on their website that they use 12 different column stills. They make 50 different whiskeys that are then blended. Where Lot 40 is made in small batches in a copper pot still, which is a totally different scale and style of production. It's generally a lower volume. The continuous stills can crank out really high volumes without ever shutting them down.
Oh, it's a large facility. I've actually been through it before, and you can drive right next to it along Lake Winnipeg, and it goes on for quite a stretch there. Yeah.
So maybe I'll come up there and we'll go do the distillery tour.
That sounds great.
At some point. And actually no, and I got my notes confused. So the copper pot still, small batches. This is actually a Canadian whiskey from bottled and aged, and it's Canadian, nothing to do with Vermont. It's called Lot 40. Do you know this one?
I've never tried that. No.
Yeah. So I bought a full size bottle of this one because I've heard good things. So I'm going to just kind of alternate and take different sips as we go here. But what's your personal thought on the Northern Harvest blend? You would prefer it to regular Crown, or what
yeah, I do. I do prefer it to the regular Purple Bag Crown. I remain surprised that it was ever nominated whiskey of the year. But it's definitely a serviceable rye. Again, it's got that classic burn and spiciness you want. It has a bit of a rounder edge than the Purple Bag Classic.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's not bad at all.
Not bad at all. They'll put that endorsement on the website. Jim Murray, best whiskey in the world. Ryan McCormick, not bad. Not bad at all. Not bad at all. So, anything else you want to say about the whiskeys, or we'll move back into we'll talk about our news stories?
Sure. Let's move onwards.
I slowed things down by talking about 3 different whiskeys, which is not the standard work, but.
How dare you?
It's my podcast. Do what I want. No, it's all right. So, first article, and I'll give some context, and Ryan, let you introduce and talk more about it. But part of the background here, Ryan sends me very consistently about once a month. There's an article. What's the Winnipeg newspaper called?
Well, the one I usually send you is the Winnipeg Sun, because that doesn't have a paywall. So it's the free Winnipeg newspaper. And
that's kind of hilarious that the Winnipeg newspaper is called the Sun, right?
Well, that is the misnomer, Mark. It is indeed cold in Winnipeg, but it is usually sunny.
Okay. We learn all kinds of things here in the podcast. Actually, it's still worth making a cheap joke over, though.
Yeah, absolutely. Actually, and that's actually how you know it's going to be really cold if it's clear and sunny. That's stay indoors weather.
So anyway, Ryan sends these articles every month, and it's often the same columnist. It's not even like a news story, but someone giving commentary about the health system. And like one month, the headline will literally say something like, emergency department wait times are up in the Winnipeg area, in the region. And then the article talks about why is it getting worse and blah, blah, blah. And then a month later, there'll be a headline that talks about, reduction in ED waiting times. And it's much more, the spokesperson has much more positive things to say, and the columnist is happy. And it doesn't alternate exactly month to month, but there's a funny pattern there. And as you mentioned earlier about process behavior charts, there's different ways of looking at this, right? Why don't you tell us more about kind of your history and your thoughts on these news stories and this view of the data?
Well, because I'm a big proponent of using tools like process behavior charts to help us understand whether we are improving or not. I got into the habit of sending these to you as an expert on this, only because it's frustrating to see these reports where I believe that it's done in good faith, However, it's just lends to confusion to the general public. It really doesn't help ever to establish whether real improvements being made. It's a situation where I think, because of the political nature of emergency wait times, especially given the current state here in Manitoba, where they're doing this rather extensive healthcare system transformation, it appears that they're desperately looking for signals when there probably isn't any.
Right. They're confusing. They're reacting to noise as if it was signals.
Well, they're desperate to show that it's improving at all costs.
We'll torture the data, we don't even have to torture the data. We'll just react to the most recent data point. But then you get the confusing things, and even the region website will show, breaking down by hospitals and overall. And then you get the confusing situation where, the wait times are better than last month, but they're worse than the same month the year before. And it's like Schrodinger's cat. It's like it's getting better and it's getting worse. So let's just not look.
And again, it's so simple, yet so elusive. The only real question anyone wants answered is it improving?
And from everything you've sent me, and the articles always talk about goals, and it's up, it's down. The one you sent me, and we'll post this in the show notes, talked about ranking the hospitals. And I'm like, is the difference between the hospitals even statistically significant? Just putting a list in a rank order, they could all be, in a way, they're all part of the same system at a high level.
And the other pattern they get into is they're quick to attribute, if the wait times are higher, they will quickly seek to explain it away. So, it could be flu season or a couple of specific incidents that have occurred, even though, again, there probably wasn't any special cause variation. And of course, if the number is lower, we're quick to attribute it to all the hard work that is being done to transform the system. So it's all very confusing, and it doesn't provide the public or people on the inside with any degree of confidence that we actually understand whether all this transformation is indeed improving or not.
Yeah. So, there's examples, and sometimes when I use the Winnipeg example in classes that I do of like looking at the headlines, let's do the 2 data point comparisons. So it's just the confusion or the bad conclusions. Like the second article that you shared, talked about how, like September 2019's average was down 13% compared to 3 years ago. And you'd say, oh, hooray. But it's also half an hour worse than it was a year ago. But what is this even signal? So then in class, and I'll share these charts, like if you even do a run chart, you can look and say, going back to 2014, it looks like the last couple of years are better. And then there's seasonality that you mentioned. So flu season, sure enough, and you can de-seasonalize the data. And then you look at it, and from like April 14th until April 17th, there are literally no signals in the chart. It's fluctuating around an average. And then starting, and this is always fascinating to hear someone describing a chart to you verbally, but this is why you need to look at the chart. But April 17 on, like all of those data points are below the baseline average. So it's not just 8 consecutive, it's a couple years worth. And it's now fluctuating around a new average that's a little lower. And I think there was some initiative that started in April 2017. So it actually does seem like a reasonable cause and effect.
Well, that was when they did the initial change to the emergency system here in Winnipeg. So it does make sense that that is an explainable shift. That's when they started consolidating our emergency departments, was right around that time.
But then, so it looks like there was kind of the step function improvement, and now it's fluctuating. And it probably doesn't make for great headlines to say healthcare or ED waiting times continue to fluctuate predictably.
Yes,
that's not driving clicks.
Absolutely. And the other narrative that's always built into this, which I find interesting too, is that they always state that the goal is to bring the wait times down to the national average. And that makes me think of, one of my first encounters reading Deming was where he was discussing kind of the silliness around grading students against an average.
Yeah.
Because, of course, on average, some, half are above and half are below. So if everybody was moving below the average, you're just shifting averages.
And when they're aiming for being at the national average, they might have somehow framed this as like an excellence program when mediocrity, that might be a better word.
No, that's absolutely consistent with my lived experience here in the Manitoba health system is we're satisfied with shooting for mediocrity. I had many experiences where it was very outward looking, very much, let's wait and see what the folks in Toronto figure out, and maybe we can copy that. Or let's see what the Calgary region's doing. Perhaps we can learn from them. I was often frustrated with the lack of internal desire to innovate and really seek improvement locally. And that's part of the dangers with these types of benchmarks is you end up chasing sometimes arbitrary numbers in when what we're really trying to do is improve the quality of care for Manitobans.
Yeah. And I would be curious to go and search, the Dallas Morning News or the Fort Worth Star Telegram and see if there are ever headlines, yet alone monthly, that talk about emergency room waiting times. And, we've got in our system, it's not a Dallas-Fort Worth Regional Health Authority. It's lots of competing hospitals, and the emphasis. Our headlines are about more about cost for understandable reasons, but waiting times and patient harm and things like that are problems that don't get talked about as much as I think they should be in the media down here.
Yeah, well, and here it's the opposite. It's that the emergency room has been the front door and the face of the healthcare system for so long. And that's actually part of the problem is if your entry point is emergency departments, then your entry point is the hospital. So the focus has always been on what's going on in hospitals. But of course, healthcare is a broad spectrum of services across a continuum where the hospital just happens to be the most expensive and the most dangerous place to actually administer care.
Yeah. And you look at waiting times, like in the U.S., emergency room waiting times are often driven by people who don't have coverage, insurance coverage. And by law, the emergency departments have to at least treat and stabilize the patient. I mean, the patient may end up with a bill. And like you said, it's a relatively expensive way to get care. In Canada, where you have universal coverage, there's different dynamics kind of driving the need to go to the emergency department for things that arguably might not be the most urgent emergencies, right?
Well, yes and no. I think that's a convenient myth, even here in Canada, where we say things like, you know what, if we just didn't have these subacute or non-urgent patients in our emergencies, we would have no problems. But healthcare is a complex system. I don't think it's that straightforward, and that's bearing out right now because, in fact, that that big shift you see on that chart was moving what we did here was we converted several emergency departments into urgent care centers and tried to stream more higher acuity to the remaining emergencies and the lower acuity to the urgent care centers. And that apparently that has shifted down the average wait times in our emergency departments, but it's certainly not enough to get us to that national average.
Yeah. I was laughing. I wrote down the phrase you were talking about convenient myths. That could have been an alternative name for the podcast if whiskey wasn't involved. That sounds like that's a podcast I would listen to if there was a series called Convenient Myths.
I'd listen to that.
So, is there any thought? So, like when you've shared stuff from the website, and I've searched, the Winnipeg Regional Health Authority sometimes publishes run charts. Like, do you have? Can I send you a copy of the book to give? Do you think we can get them doing process behavior charts?
Well, you're making an assumption that they want to apply scientific thinking in this context, but of course, I believe that's the problem. That was actually I get asked a lot of questions about my time in healthcare from people in industry, and one of the most surprising things I always tell people is when I first went into healthcare, I assumed that it would be a place where scientific thinking would be celebrated.
I felt the same way.
And of course, we were both surprised probably when we found that that's really actually not the case. And in fact, one of the very first things I was asked to do, and I only remember this in preparation for our discussion today, I was working for a sort of like a project management office that would be tasked to do analysis of just different operations and in hopes that we could learn how to improve. And a task ended up on my desk, and it said, hey, there's a master's student writing their thesis, and it was related to access in an emergency department. And it said, could you go and pull the data to prove this thesis true?
Now, like, I'm an engineer. Like, engineering and science are different, but even to me, that doesn't sound like good science.
Well, and it's absolutely not good science. But of course, I was eager to please my superiors, and I remember, so I poured through all this data, and there was no evidence at all that this particular intervention did reduce wait times. So of course I presented that because that's what you do, right? I said there's no statistical evidence to support this claim, and they said, could you look at it again? And that was my very first experience to healthcare, and that should have given me a sign for what I was to encounter later on.
Yeah,
but that was a surprise to me. Is this just the general not disdain for scientific thinking, but it's just not as ubiquitous as you would think it would be in a field like healthcare.
I mean, I found there's two sides to the science versus art coin, that people sometimes will, when it's to their benefit, kind of point to science, and they'll do things like, maybe this is transitioning into the pet peeve segment. Here we go. Here's a pet peeve of mine. When people say things like, well, okay, I want to see the research that proves that lean is better than the way we manage today. Like, well, I don't know if that's really science. Then back to the first point, though, then like sometimes when you point to science, people will say, well, hey, wait a minute, you got to remember, medicine is an art, when that's beneficial. But when you look at, people will demand journal article proof that lean is the better approach, when there was absolutely no journal article that proves the current system of managing is better than what the different alternatives would be. So that's my pet peeve. I think in a nutshell, it would be asking for journal articles to prove something that life experience could prove. Like, we could do our own experiment, because the other thing is when you show journal evidence and they'll say, yeah, but we're different. So then they'll discard the journal. So.
Yeah, that's definitely consistent with my experience working in healthcare. There was a lot of cherry picking data that supports your specific narrative, usually in service to maintaining the status quo, but not always. Obviously, I'm painting this to be fairly negative, but to your point, it was always expected that the burden of proof for an improvement would have to be so overwhelming, but we never expected the burden of proof for whatever the current practices were. I like to talk too about like my favorite example, and this is something that's deeply ingrained, especially with emergency room nurse culture, is the full moon effect. I used to see this a lot, where there would be a particularly intense day in the emergency department, perhaps a series of really acute and really intense situations, and then undoubtedly I would hear, well, that's full moon out. And what was fascinating about that is that this is deeply believed, but of course, because I'm a scientific thinker and pretty geeky, and I had access to emergency room data, I do recall, just for fun and with a friend of mine, that we pulled the data to look at acuity versus the lunar cycle. Mm-hmm. And of course, we found absolutely no correlation. But it's just another example of the confirmation bias and this cherry picking of data to support your narrative. I mean, you can easily imagine being a nurse in an emergency room in what felt like a particularly bad shift. And as you're walking across the parking lot to your vehicle, you gaze up and you see the full moon, and then you just make that connection. But nobody's ever walking back to their car after a bad shift and say, you know what? It's a waxing gibbous moon. I just knew it.
Well, God forbid it's a full moon and Friday the 13th.
Oh, yeah,
let's just shut the doors. That's going to be an awful day.
But what are your thoughts on why such a lack of scientific thinking, especially when it comes to the operations of healthcare processes?
I'm not the right guy to answer that, but I mean, I think one of my surprises coming into healthcare is that I thought things would be run much better than they are as like a baseline starting point. The amount of chaos and I try to be fair. I'm like, a lot of people in healthcare are not taught about operations in school. That's kind of left like, well, you'll figure that out in the field, and then superstition and bad practice get passed on to the next generation. And then I think this is more important than a pet peeve, but the pet peeve of somebody in healthcare, this is not everybody, but some people in healthcare that kind of look down their nose at manufacturing and like, well, what we do in healthcare is so important. It's a matter of life or death. And then like the evidence of how things actually work and how things are managed don't seem to jibe with what we do is so important. It's a matter of life and death, like in terms of a lack of error proofing, systematic overburden of employees, and things that don't necessarily seem to be evidence that patient safety is always the top priority, this is taking a dark turn, but I mean, that's an easy thing for a hospital spokesperson to say after there's some embarrassing incident in the news. Oh, well, it's always our top priority.
Well, yeah, I think you've nailed it there. I've given this a lot of thought, especially since I've stepped away from healthcare, and there's so many good and dedicated people out there working in really difficult conditions to provide the best care they can, and they wrap themselves in this identity around providing care, and I'm grateful for it, because without that and without that strong sense of purpose and mission, we can only imagine what the quality of care would be. However, to your point, it's when presented with it, any of this is rejected by the culture. So like, I actually recall very clearly in 2008 at St. Boniface here, I'll mention I was at St. Boniface Hospital. We had a CEO who was very dedicated to improving the quality of patient care, and using principles or like lean and others to reduce harm.
Right.
And so one of his first steps was to draw in all the clinical leaders and operational leaders in a room and kind of give like, let's rally around this rather compelling and should have been an aligned reason for action, which was, we need to reduce harm.
Yeah.
And the reaction in the room was, we can't actually say we cause harm in the hospital. Yeah. There was this huge reaction saying, there's no way we're going to support even writing those words down on a flip chart. So, and yet it's, of course, objectively, it's a fact that harm is caused in a hospital care setting. Yeah. But it's so counter to their identity around what they believe and who they are and their mission in healthcare, that it just creates this dissonance that makes it really hard to navigate.
Yeah. So maybe there's a transition here to our second news story when you talk about, not being able to say, talking about the real reality, and the context within the second article is really interesting. If you want to introduce this article, you had first sent it to me back over the holidays, and I've reread it a couple of times now. And boy, we could talk about this story for an hour alone. This is where like that late night Lean Healthcare Transformation Summit discussion, goes on for hours because there's so much to talk about. So we'll my babbling here is eating into the time that I was trying to be mindful of. But let's talk about this article a little bit, and we'll post a link to the news story and the blog post in question. Can you introduce some of this?
Sure. I can't remember how I came across it. Maybe I was on my Twitter feed, but I did see a Toronto Star article. It said CEO being accused of throwing their nurses under the bus after working an overnight shift. So, of course, I read that, and then it refers specifically to this particular CEO of a hospital system in Newmarket, Ontario, that decided to work an overnight shift in an acute care hospital, and then she blogs about it on her. I guess it's a personal blog, or it's related to the role.
It's and by work, it was really more that she shadowed people. Like, she was present for a shift. It's different than like if she was actually working clinically for a shift.
Yeah, that's an important distinction. She's the CEO. She's not actually going to be providing hands-on patient care. I think this is a pretty official blog because it has the South Lake Regional Health Center logo here, and here's her picture, the real deal. Yeah, the real. Yeah, it's the title itself is telling as well. But so I read the article at first, and I was like, okay, well, how bad could the blog post be, really? So I decided to read it, and it's not that it's bad, but there's some very interesting things in here, and it was as a lean guy reading this, I was like, this is a master class on how not to do gemba. Let's I thought I'd start with my positive support for this activity. I mean, she did go to gemba in order to seek understanding and wrap her head around the conditions that her staff were in and that her patients experience. And she, to her credit, she didn't do one of these undercover boss things. That's one of my pet peeves.
I read about a Windsor hospital CEO who did the undercover thing.
Yeah, I'm not a fan of that. I know some people are, but to me, that just seems to defeat the purpose and be disingenuous. But the blog starts off good. She talks about her intention and the context around the shift. She even goes and specifically recognizes some of her great staff for really specific behaviors that she thought was good, which I thought was that's very good form when you go to gemba. If you recognize the behaviors you want to see, then that's usually good form. But then it started to take an interesting turn. So she talks about the positive things, and then she said, well, here's some of the less positive things that I saw, and so she does offer up observations and then what she thinks. But I'm a fan of, if you're going to gemba, you want to offer up observations with limited judgment. And this is where I think it goes a little off the rails. But what were your thoughts?
Well, I think the headline from the news story is accurate. I did read it as her throwing staff under the bus. It's funny, you talk about starting, even your comments, you start with the positive. Like, her blog post was the classic feedback sandwich of, well, I'm going to say something positive, and I'm going to give you some negative, and then I'm going to finish with something positive. Like, her feedback sandwich was like one of these giant overstuffed pastrami sandwiches.
Absolutely.
And the thing, like, I'm all for transparency when it comes to data, and you've got to share data. If you can't admit that patients are harmed, and you can't share that data so patients might make better choices, you're just getting in the way of improvement. But I saw through the article, like, she continually wrote of these different systemic problems, that the hallways were cold and drafty, and shame on you, staff, for using blankets to help keep, or flannel to help keep yourself warm. And well, but then again, the hallways are full of patients who are cold because it's drafty. So why is it drafty? There was really no anywhere close to 5 whys analysis. Why are the hallways full of patients? She played a bit of a blame game around staff for taking, this might be factually correct, but she said staff are taking breaks that are longer than they should be. But I was just, and she was airing all this dirty laundry, and there was nothing in the story as she wrote it where she did anything as a leader. Like she said there was a nurse
blog about it.
Yeah. But like in the moment, she wrote, they popped into a unit for 30 seconds and nobody acknowledged us. And then it seems like she got frustrated and kind of huffed out of the room. Like, why not stop and say something and provide some coaching? Or, she said there was a nurse who was throwing around a lot of F-bombs, and like, it's not that difficult to say, hey, wait a minute. Hi, I'm sure you're really frustrated, but, at least try to do something to calm the situation down. And so the one time she took action, like, she said there was a big mess, and she was like, well, it only took 30 seconds and I cleaned it up. So like she committed like this workaround, and it was just really unclear. I think there's a time, like, you need to manage these things internally. And like, when you read the comments in the blog post, a lot of people said, like, well, you're complaining about all this stuff, but everything you saw is a reflection on your leadership. Like, ow. But
yeah, I was surprised at the lack of ownership in the writing. And I told you in an email, like, I'm actually surprised that this blog post is still up there. So I'm assuming she's standing by these comments, or who knows. But I mean, some specific things that are worth talking about is, like, you described the situation where she goes up to the unit with the patient and is not acknowledged. They said the nurse is busy on the phone. And it was a judge statement where we have no idea what this nurse was doing on the phone. And that's the challenge with this stuff, is it's so easy to climb that ladder of inference when you're doing observations like this. But it's a leader's job to make sure, you check some of those assumptions before we make these kind of judgments.
Well, I think to answer your question, she was standing by the blog post, because she posted a long comment where she said something like, well, I was hoping to stimulate discussion.
Well, mission accomplished there.
Yeah. And, and she said, I was surprised by the level of defensiveness. I'm like, well, she did really blame individuals for what are arguably systemic problems, and it's human nature to get defensive. She in and of herself is being defensive. So how could she kind of, in a veiled way, criticize the natural defensiveness of others? It's hard to understand. I'm disappointed in her as a leader, I'm sorry to say.
Yeah, and there's other very interesting things, and there she further goes on to suggest that the collective agreement is to blame for the behavior she saw as well. Even at one point saying she's not suggesting a scenario of martial law.
That's a weird thing to propose.
But it was a very much a classic, we depend on your best efforts. And I know that the hospital's old, and I know that the hospital's cluttered, and I know that the emergency room's full, and I know that you're cold and you're wearing these flannels, and I know that you don't have a break room where you can take a nap, but that doesn't stop you from coming in with a positive attitude and working really, really hard. And I was like, well, I think you nailed it on the head there. What are you doing, and what are your leaders doing to create the conditions necessary to provide the best care possible, rather than just rely on people to work around those problems?
And yeah, it's really, I mean, it's just, it's frustrating that, again, like, I think she should have brought these issues up. There were some things she could have done something with in the moment. The rest of it should have been brought up internally within the leadership chain. And she asked in her comment, should a CEO keep the negative aspects secret and only talk about what's good? Like, well,
No, absolutely.
no.
She's missing the point there.
I think she's missing the point. I agree. And, she complained about, well, I'm getting all of these anonymous attacks. And I think, for one, like the comments I read were all about what she did and what she didn't do. I didn't see a lot of just, name calling or, that, the internet breeds that sort of behavior. And I thought the responses were actually, they were critical, but I thought they were really thoughtful. And I tended to agree with the criticism. And then she went and, she called these attacks. I'm like, oh gosh, here we go.
Well, and one of my favorite lines in the blog, and it's kind of like a throwaway line buried in the middle somewhere, where she said, she was being critical of a behavior she witnessed, and she said something to the effect of, "That's not how we do it here at South Lake." And I'm like, well, it absolutely is. You witnessed it, and it is how you do it. So that's one of those. It's easy to do too, where sometimes when you're removed from the work, as many CEOs are, you build up a narrative or a picture of how you think the culture actually is, and then when you actually see it, again, you run into this inconvenient truth. This is how you do things at South Lake, and now it's time to attend to that.
That's the definition of culture, of how we do things, what happens, the mental models, and you can't just excuse that and say, well, look at, these are our stated values, and we hang signs everywhere, and it's on the website saying what our values are. Well, that might be an aspiration, but that doesn't mean that's the reality of the culture.
And I will, I will say I understand some of what she saw and some of her reaction. That doesn't excuse it, but I used to catch myself climbing that ladder of inference, walking around the hospital, and you see whatever, like she saw a mess on the floor or someone not acknowledging, and it's very easy to start making assumptions that, oh, well, that person obviously doesn't care. Maybe they don't want to be here. That's not the way we do things. But the reality is a lot more complicated than that. And you don't really know what it's like to walk in people's shoes, even just by doing shadowing on a visit.
Yeah. So we will link in the show notes to those, to the article, to the blog post. And I scroll down and it says comments are closed.
Yeah, well, that's probably a smart move. But
72 comments later, but she was complaining about anonymous attacks, and I'm like, well, it might be an environment where people are certainly afraid to try to speak truth to power. And when you have a blog, unless you don't allow comments, I can understand why people would post anonymous feedback. There's something else. I'm going to blog about it. There was a hospital in England where the headline was about how, I think the gist of the story is that there was a patient who died because of what's arguably preventable medical error. And somebody wrote an anonymous letter to the family, kind of being like a whistleblower, outlining, here are all the things that went wrong. And then the hospital's response is to hire handwriting analysis experts.
Oh my goodness.
And trying to figure out who the whistleblower is. And I think, well, talk about not getting to the root cause. Like, I'm sure that person only took the step to reach out to the family because any attempt to do something constructive internally was not leading anywhere.
Well, on the positive side too, we are seeing a lot more interest in healthcare organizations and others in creating cultures of psychological safety for this reason. So I'm hoping to see the impact of that over time. But that's the risk when people start getting into lean too. They'll say things like, lean guys like you and I will say, you know what, as the CEO, you should spend more time in the work and go to sea. But what you and I also know and others do over time is it's not just about going to sea. It's about observing. It's about showing respect. It's about doing it in service to improvement and creating understanding, versus this person went to see, thought they experienced, the same thing that the staff did, passed some significant judgment on without all the facts, and is surprised when she gets some blowback.
Well, thank you for sharing that article. It was certainly a lot to chew on and to think about. So in terms of the podcast sandwich, we had some laughs. We dove into some serious, meaty subjects, and now maybe can you help us end with a bit of a laugh? So when my friend Crystal Totterman was on the podcast, we each shared a story about the funniest thing that's happened to you in process improvement. It doesn't mean it's hilarious, but I guess something's got to be the funniest moment. Can you tell the Shingijutsu story that you kind of alluded to earlier?
Yeah, I could tell that, and maybe I'll allude to that maple leaf story I was telling you about too. But yeah. I mean, it's only because lately I've been seeing a lot of comments and posts on LinkedIn about wistful recollections of the Shingijutsu senseis of the past, and that my actual very first foray into lean was with Shingijutsu at Boeing. But I've never been really exposed to their culture or how they think. And I believe it might have even been like my second week on the job. I was thrown in as a team member on a Kaizen event. And part of that involves the sensei coming out and doing some observations, asking you questions, doing sensei things. But I was fairly naive to how that works. So they didn't speak English too, so they had an interpreter. And I remember I was by a materials rack of some kind. I think it was for actually storing like defects or non-conforming parts that you'd have to walk back and forth to. And I was standing by there and I was explaining to the sensei about we were making some improvements to reduce cycle time and improve the flow through the area. So the interpreter says to me, well, the sensei is recommending that the rack be moved closer to the work. And I was like, oh, that's great. But what I didn't realize is when they suggest things, it's an order. So I started walking away, and the interpreter is still talking to me. She goes, excuse me, the sensei says he recommends that it would be better if you move the rack closer to the work. And I was like, yeah, can you tell sensei I heard him the first time? And this did not play well. And coming up and more meeting my eye line, and the interpreter, of course, is trying to mirror his emotion and speaking loudly. Yeah. Like, the sensei is recommending you move this rack. I was like, so finally somebody comes up and says, just buddy, just move the rack. It was my introduction to the semi-Socratic method of Shingijutsu senseis to a completely naive young engineer, newly minted engineer from school. Yeah. But wow. It is an interesting style and method that I learned quickly the hard way.
Yeah, well, this is a secondhand story from my wife, but she was on the periphery of, I think she was going to the daily report outs on a Shingijutsu-led Kaizen event. And her recollection was, yes, of course, it was the older Japanese male consultant and the really young Japanese woman as the translator. And you talk about mirroring the emotion. My wife, what she saw was very different. Like the sensei would be almost kind of like hopping up and down, angry and yelling about something. And then the translator would say something like, with a smile, "Sensei thinks that could be a little bit better." And it sounded really toned down.
Yeah, it's the there are other things I was just didn't understand about the culture too. I remember actually sitting with one of the senseis in the lunchroom once, and this was back when there was like a smoking area outside the cafeteria. So the interpreter said, "Hey, the sensei is interested if you want to have lunch with him." I was like, "Sure." he said, "Oh, well, he wants to go out on the patio." I'm like, "Great."
Yeah.
So I'm not kidding. This guy's lunch was like, he stacked up 3 donuts on a plate and ate them with a knife and a fork, and then proceeded to smoke at least half a pack of cigarettes. And then he offered me a cigarette too. And I said, "Well, not really. I'm trying to cut back." And he said, "Why? You're so young." And which was confusing. And for all of you listening on the podcast right now, I do sound like this all the time. And so he also suggests through the interpreter, the sensei says, "The sensei thinks you would make a wonderful singer." I was like, "Wow."
You do have a deep voice there, but it's not because of smoking.
Well, and I'm definitely tone deaf and have no talent in the musical arena whatsoever. But while this is, we're making light of these situations, I did learn a lot in my brief time there from them, and it kind of got me interested in this as a career. But it was a real culture shock, and you can see why people do sometimes resist the idea of, well, that's Japanese philosophy and it doesn't play out here. There are sometimes legitimate cultural differences that get in the way.
Yeah. So then what's the second story? Maple Leaf. This is not a hockey story. This is from the food business.
Yeah, it's from a food company I worked at. And again, the only reason I bring this up is I was just trying to think of funny things that happen. I can think of many, but we were really into Six Sigma. I do believe the company still is. And it was quite a rigorous implementation of the program. And so when you completed a project, you were required to, validate the return on investment. And once in a while, they would send an auditor out to the plant to make sure you weren't lying, essentially, and you could actually prove that your projects were delivering. And we were, like anytime an auditor visits, you're always nervous. And so this auditor came in from headquarters in Toronto, came to visit our plant here in Winnipeg. And I was touring him around. I was explaining him some of the technical aspects of the operation that we were improving. And he was completely disinterested in all of this conversation. And I found that surprising. So I'm trying to walk him through all the technical aspects. And he's walking around, he's looking around. He's like, "Does anything interesting ever happen around here?" And I was like, "Well, what do you mean?" And I mentioned to him, I go, "Well, I heard about a year ago that some people were caught like having sex in this area of the plant." And from then on, he became very interested in the rest of the tour. And we got along famously from that. So all I had to do was explain all the sordid details of anything that was happening. These were all rumors. I have nothing untoward I'd ever witnessed happening there. But I just thought it was interesting that the auditor was much more interested in any salacious details I could invent or secondhand pass on to him, but rather than the actual metrics. What about you?
Well, I don't have any funny auditor stories, but there's a secondhand story. And I've shared this on the blog and it's on YouTube. There was the 1980 NBC documentary called "If Japan Can, Why Can't We?" And that's a documentary that really introduced Dr. Deming to an American audience.
Yeah, I've seen that. Yes.
Yeah. So in that documentary, and the documentary kind of veered around in some different directions, but there was some guy at a factory who complained about, I think it was somebody from OSHA. It might have been the EPA, but either way, there was someone from the government that was coming and there to do like this official audit. And the guy, and this is an NBC News documentary, so who knows if they found a second source. I mean, the guy was willing to tell the story on national TV that he's like, "Oh, the auditor wanted to just sit and he wanted to talk about baseball for hours." And he said, "Well, I didn't want to do that." And so I said, "Hey, I have work to do." And, the guy basically said like, "Hey, there's two choices here. We can sit and talk about baseball all day, or I could go out and do an audit and I'm going to find a lot of problems."
Well, I think the choice is clear.
Yeah, let's debate whether Pete Rose should be in the Hall of Fame or not. Let's talk about that for an hour. Go.
That'd be a good audit.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if there's I don't have any particular funny story off the top of my head. As soon as we stop the podcast, I'll think of something.
Absolutely. Well, you got to keep some material for future episodes too.
Yeah. Well, maybe, I mean, maybe we'll do one again down the road, because there's like I said, but I'm going to plug the Operational Excellence mixtape again. There's so much good content there that people can have their own discussions about over coffee or whiskey or whatever's appropriate for the time of day. Calling it a mixtape, maybe final question, that kind of shows our age a little bit, right?
Absolutely. Yeah, I'm firmly in the Gen X camp, and that's becoming more and more evident as days pass.
Because nowadays it would be like the Operational Excellence playlist.
Yeah, that's actually a pretty good name.
But it's easier to come up with pictures of cassette tapes to go along with the the email and the blog posts there. That's fine. So yeah, our Gen X malaise, and we don't really care about anything. That's the stereotype of our generation, right? Did I lose you?
Nope.
Oh, okay. I'm like, wow, you're so Gen X, you don't even care about responding to.
Oh, sorry, I was having a sip there.
Okay. My internet here is shaky, so I jumped to a conclusion that I had lost you. But Ryan, hey, this has been a lot of fun. I won't be able to continue this until 1 or 2 in the morning or whenever the heck that was at the summit. But I'll tell you, kind of closing the loop on whiskey. I really enjoyed the Whistle Pig. I finished the little airplane bottle of that. And I did have a little sip more of the Lot 40. They win the gold and the silver, and I guess Crown Royal wins the bronze. So we'll play "Oh Canada," which I know the word. Don't make me sing either, but I know the words because I've gone to a lot of NHL games in the U.S. And growing up around Detroit, we get exposed a lot to that. So
well, sorry to hear if you're a Red Wings fan.
Hey, we had a good run.
That's right. It's rebuilding time.
Yes, they're aiming to be maybe 50th percentile of the league. That would be progress. How are your Winnipeg Jets doing now that you got a team back?
Yeah, I'd say we're having a better year than people anticipated. We might squeak into the playoffs this year, but they're a plucky team that's had some major turnover. They're doing better, and you never know, they could surprise.
Well, I hope so. The Red Wings are clearly not going to make the playoffs. So,
yeah, no, I think
Dallas Stars and maybe second. The Winnipeg Jets are my second favorite team. I did get to go to a game in Winnipeg a couple years ago with a mutual friend that you used to work with.
I am fairly confident you and I went to a game once here too.
Did he give the two of us the tickets? Is that what happened?
Yeah, I think it might have even been the Red Wings. I can't quite recall. I'm fairly sure I went to a game with you here in Winnipeg. I could be wrong. But.
It wasn't the Red Wings. I saw the Red Wings play in Edmonton. I remember that vividly. No, I'm pretty sure I'm pretty sure I went with our pal.
It's possible.
Yeah. So you did good until you had your first whiskey, and you mentioned if you were avoiding mentioning St. Boniface, you held out for a while. But and maybe just to raise a glass to you did mention without mentioning by name Michel Tétrault, who unfortunately passed away, and I know we both liked and respected him a lot. So
absolutely, here's to you, Dr. Tétrault.
Yes. All right, so that ended up. Well, but all right. That's the whiskey talking, but no, that's not a sad note. We're just trying to honor a friend here in the podcast. So, hey, Ryan, let's do this again. but it's always fun chatting with you, and I'll look forward to more of the mixtapes. But I would encourage people, if this is the first episode you've heard, you can go back and hear other episodes. You can find us at leanwhiskey.com. You can also go to leanblog.org/leanwhiskey, or if you like our pal Jamie Flinchbaugh better, you can go to jflinch.com/leanwhiskey. You can find us on Apple Podcasts, Google Play, Spotify, Stitcher, and other places. So if you take a second, rate and review the podcast, subscribe if you haven't already. And we're going to try to bring you, as we say, the tagline for the podcast, lean talk with a fun spirit. Ryan, I hope you feel like we accomplished that tonight.
Absolutely. It was a great time. Thanks so much, Mark.
Yeah. Thank you for your contribution in both dimensions. So thanks again.
All right. Bye now.
I'm going to clink the glasses signifying us toasting. Cheers to you. Take care.
Cheers. Good night.
Night.